April 24, 1944. High above the German heartland, more than 7 kilometers over Brandenburg, a Luftwaffe fighter clawed through the thin air. Inside the cockpit of a Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6, Major Gunther Rall struggled for oxygen, each breath turning his mask opaque with condensation. Gravity pressed him into his seat as he rolled into a steep diving maneuver, one that, by every rule of aerial combat he had ever known, should have shaken any enemy off his tail. But it didn't. Behind him, an American fighter remained locked in position, effortlessly matching the dive. Through the crackling static of his radio, Rall heard alarm in voices that once commanded the skies of Europe. These were not rookies. They were veterans of campaigns stretching back to 1940, men who had survived France, Britain, and the Eastern Front. Now they were shouting warnings like cadets in their first engagement. Enemy at 6 o'clock, above me, still closing, speed 400 kilometers per hour. He's not dropping away. How is this possible? For years, German fighter pilots had relied on a simple, almost mathematical certainty. American escorts could not follow them indefinitely. Their fighters ran short on fuel, their engines lost power at altitude. Once German pilots disengaged and turned for home, pursuit usually ended. That certainty collapsed in the spring of 1944. The aircraft stalking Rall's formation was a P-51 Mustang, powered by a Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. At altitudes where earlier American fighters, Thunderbolts and Lightnings, had struggled to breathe, the Mustang thrived. Its engine delivered steady power in the thin air, transforming the upper reaches of the sky into American territory. What made the situation even more alarming was distance. The Mustang chasing Rall had already flown hundreds of kilometers from its base in England. Even now, deep over Germany, it still carried enough fuel for extended combat and the long flight back across occupied Europe and the Channel. Rall's own fuel gauge told a harsher story. Barely 15 minutes remained before reaching Brandenburg, assuming he could disengage at all. In a single morning, the balance of air warfare had inverted. Altitude, range, endurance, every variable that once favored the Luftwaffe had shifted. Over their own capital, German pilots were no longer the predators. They were being hunted. What Major Rall witnessed that day was not simply the appearance of a new enemy aircraft. It marked the beginning of the systematic collapse of German air power. Within 12 months, the Luftwaffe would lose roughly 3/4 of its pilots. Nearly all of its seasoned commanders, men whose experience could not be replaced, would be gone. By mid-1945, Germany would no longer contest control of its own skies. The instrument of this transformation was remarkable not only for its performance, but for its origins. The P-51 was designed in just over 3 months. It relied on a British engine design. It was produced in numbers that overwhelmed German planners, and it was flown by American pilots who seemed to appear faster than they could be destroyed. The crisis that made such an aircraft essential had been building for months. On August 17, 1943, the U.S. 8th Air Force launched deep strikes against the industrial centers of Schweinfurt and Regensburg. The cost was catastrophic. 60 B-17 flying fortresses failed to return. Hundreds of airmen were killed or captured in a single day. Loss rates on these deep penetration missions reached between 20 and 25%, numbers no air force could sustain. Yet despite the bombing, German fighter output continued to rise. The Luftwaffe was replacing aircraft faster than the Allies expected. In Berlin, senior German commanders reviewed the statistics with confidence. General Adolf Galland and other Luftwaffe leaders understood the arithmetic of attrition. Each American bomber carried 10 crew members, trained specialists who required months, sometimes years, to prepare. German fighters, by contrast, usually carried a single pilot. The exchange ratio favored Germany. One lost fighter for 10 enemy aircrew was a trade the Luftwaffe could accept. By the autumn of 1943, German strategy appeared sound. American escorts could not protect bombers deep into Germany. Beyond the Rhine, Allied fighters were forced to turn back. That was where German interceptors concentrated, waiting for the moment when the bombers were exposed and vulnerable. On August 14, 1943, later remembered as Black Thursday, this strategy reached its brutal peak. Another raid on Schweinfurt cost the 8th Air Force 60 bombers and more than 600 men. From the German perspective, the campaign seemed sustainable. From the American side, it was approaching collapse. What neither side fully understood at that moment was that the equation was about to change. Not through tactics alone, but through technology, production, and range. The Mustang would soon escort bombers not just to the Rhine, but to Berlin, Brandenburg, and beyond. And once American fighters no longer turned back, the Luftwaffe's war of attrition became unwinnable. The skies over Germany would never be the same again. For nearly 4 months, the American strategic bombing effort over Europe stalled. Deep penetration raids into the heart of Germany were suspended, and the skies beyond the Reich's borders effectively belonged to the Luftwaffe. German fighter pilots, emboldened by repeated successes, believed they had secured air dominance, not through innovation, but simply because geography favored them. Allied escort fighters could not follow bombers far enough. The battle, it seemed, was already decided. What the German pilots did not realize was that a quiet revolution was unfolding on both sides of the Atlantic. A rare alignment of engineering brilliance and industrial scale was about to overturn everything they thought they knew about air warfare. The aircraft that would redefine the air war originated from a British request in April 1940. North American aviation was tasked with designing a new fighter for the Royal Air Force, and the pace of development was unprecedented. From initial sketches to a flying prototype took just over 3 months, with the first flight occurring only 149 days after the contract was signed, a feat unmatched anywhere else during the war. Early versions of what would become the P-51 Mustang were powered by the American Allison V-1710 engine. While the aircraft showed promise at lower altitudes, its performance dropped sharply above 15,000 feet. Unfortunately, this was exactly the altitude where bomber formations operated and where escort fighters were most desperately needed. As a result, the Mustang's initial combat value was limited. The turning point came in the spring of 1942. Rolls-Royce test pilot Ronald Harker proposed an unconventional solution, replacing the Allison engine with the British Rolls-Royce Merlin. When the modified aircraft took to the air, the results were astonishing. The combination of the Mustang's sleek aerodynamic design and the Merlin's high-altitude performance transformed the aircraft entirely. It was no longer merely adequate, it was exceptional. Meanwhile, industrial muscle entered the equation. In August 1941, the Packard Motor Company in Detroit began producing the Merlin engine under license. Applying American mass production methods to British precision engineering, Packard dramatically increased output. By late 1943, hundreds of Merlin engines were leaving the factory each month. At altitude, these engines delivered around 1,650 horsepower, exactly where German pilots had previously felt untouchable. Some within Allied leadership grasped the significance early. In July 1942, Colonel Thomas Hitchcock, the U.S. military attaché in London and a former World War I aviator, submitted a remarkably accurate assessment. He concluded that a Merlin-powered P-51 would outperform every existing fighter above 25,000 feet, possess the range to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, and potentially reshape the entire strategic balance of the war in Europe. By December 1943, theory turned into reality.
On December 1st, a formation of Focke-Wulf fighters lifted off to intercept American bombers near Solingen. The German pilots were seasoned veterans, collectively credited with thousands of aerial victories. For more than a year, they had refined their attack methods against bomber streams that routinely lost their escorts long before reaching German airspace. As expected, they observed Allied escort fighters breaking away. P-47 Thunderbolts dipped their wings in farewell, signaling the familiar end of protection. The German formation prepared to attack. Then, confusion erupted over the radio. Enemy fighters were still present, a new type, remaining with the bombers. 8 P-51B Mustangs from the 354th Fighter Group, later known as the Pioneer Mustang Group, had not turned back. Equipped with external drop tanks, they had extended their range by roughly 150 miles, enough to stay with the bombers far deeper into Germany than ever before. The Luftwaffe pilots, psychologically conditioned by months of unopposed attacks, were caught off guard. This was a battle they had not expected to fight. Less than 2 weeks later, the shock intensified. On December 13th, Allied bombers struck targets near Kiel, over 420 miles from the nearest Allied airfield. This time, Mustang escorts were present in force. 16 P-51Bs not only protected the bombers, but actively hunted German fighters, abandoning the traditional defensive escort role in favor of aggressive sweeps. Near Bremen, Major Georg Peter Eder of JG-1 encountered the Mustangs. A highly experienced ace with 78 confirmed victories, Eder had developed tailored tactics for every Allied aircraft he faced. Thunderbolts could be outmaneuvered at altitude. Spitfires lacked the endurance for deep escort. P-38 Lightnings struggled in turning combat.
The Mustang fit none of these patterns. In his after-action report, Eder noted that initial contact occurred at approximately 7,500 meters. The enemy fighters retained superior speed and maneuverability compared to his B-109G at that altitude. One Mustang pursued his aircraft for nearly 30 kilometers, disengaging only when fuel limitations forced the German fighters to land. The Americans, by contrast, continued their escort mission without any visible concern for range. Days later, another Luftwaffe ace, Oberfeldwebel Heinz Knoke of JG-11, recorded his impressions in his diary. By then, the reality was undeniable. The airspace that once belonged to the Luftwaffe was no longer safe. A new aircraft had arrived, one that could follow bombers anywhere, fight on equal or superior terms, and stay as long as it wished. The balance of the air war had shifted, and it would never return to what it had been. The sudden appearance of American fighter aircraft over Hanover triggered a profound shift in German aerial operations. Previously, Luftwaffe pilots could ascend to intercept incoming bombers at a measured pace, confident they had sufficient time to reach optimal altitude and tactical positioning. That sense of control vanished with the arrival of long-range escort fighters, forcing immediate climbs upon any sighting under threat of being swiftly engaged by these new adversaries. The war, once experienced at a distance, had now arrived on German soil. When German intelligence finally acquired accurate performance data for the P-51B Mustang in January 1944, it provoked shock and disbelief among Luftwaffe leadership. The aircraft's specifications revealed capabilities far beyond any German fighter at high altitude. A top speed of 440 miles per hour at 30,000 feet, a combat radius of 2.8 miles with auxiliary fuel tanks, and a maximum service ceiling of 42,000 feet, well above the safe operational altitude for most German pilots. Climb performance measured 3,475 feet per minute, surpassing the B-109G once above 20,000 feet.
Armament consisted of 6 50-caliber machine guns, each with 1,880 rounds, enabling sustained engagement with enemy aircraft. Moreover, the Mustang's laminar flow wing design dramatically reduced drag by roughly 30% compared to conventional wings, maintaining smooth airflow across 60% of the wing chord and enabling unprecedented combination of speed and range. This aerodynamic innovation made true long-range escort possible, transforming strategic bombing operations.
The so-called Big Week from February 20th to 25th, 1944 showcased the full force of this transformation. More than 1,000 Allied bombers, accompanied by 900 fighters, including 150 P-51Bs, struck aircraft production facilities throughout Germany in a series of coordinated attacks. For the first time, American fighters transitioned from mere protective escorts to aggressive hunters, directly challenging Luftwaffe air superiority. German losses were heavy. 355 fighters were destroyed, but the blow was amplified by the deaths of roughly 100 highly experienced pilots, including many formation leaders. The loss of these Staffelkapitän and Gruppenkommandeur officers represented a depletion of irreplaceable tactical knowledge, leaving younger, less experienced pilots without guidance and weakening the organizational cohesion of the fighter force. March 4, 1944 marked another critical juncture. For the first time, American bombers struck Berlin under the protection of a fighter screen. Approximately 660 B-17 and B-24 bombers, escorted by P-51 Mustangs, P-38 Lightnings, and P-47 Thunderbolts, darkened the skies over the Reich's capital. Adolf Galland personally led a hastily assembled group of Bf-109Gs against the raid. His report to Goering was unflinchingly candid. The Luftwaffe was outnumbered 3-1, with the Mustangs enjoying superior altitude, speed, and tactical positioning. Despite valiant efforts, German pilots managed only minimal damage to 3 bombers before being forced to retreat. Galland himself was pursued for over 50 kilometers by 2 Mustangs, whose endurance and fuel reserves allowed them to harass him at will. The raid over Berlin shattered any remaining illusion of German air dominance, while civilians, previously convinced of Luftwaffe superiority, observed silver Mustangs performing aerobatics over landmarks such as the Brandenburg Gate. The regime's credibility, already weakened by battlefield setbacks, suffered further erosion. By April 1944, American fighter tactics had evolved into a dual-threat strategy. After completing escort missions, pilots would descend to treetop altitude on the return leg, striking opportunistic targets with devastating effect. German airfields, once considered safe after Allied formations had passed, became highly vulnerable. On April 13, 1944, 42 Mustangs from the 4th Fighter Group executed a precision strike across Bavarian airfields. Within just 30 minutes, they destroyed 51 aircraft on the ground, damaged an additional 23, killed numerous ground personnel, and wrecked essential maintenance infrastructure. By May, the Luftwaffe confronted a severe pilot crisis. Monthly losses exceeded 25% of operational strength, while training programs struggled to produce competent replacements. In 1944, a typical German fighter pilot received only 110 to 160 flight hours before entering combat, compared to the 400 hours logged by American pilots, and significantly lower than the 220 to 250 hours provided to German pilots just a few years earlier in 1941. This disparity in experience, combined with overwhelming Allied firepower and superior aircraft performance, marked the beginning of a terminal decline for the Luftwaffe's ability to contest the skies effectively. By the beginning of 1945, the Luftwaffe faced an alarming shortage of experienced pilots. Some German aviators were entering combat after accumulating barely 80 hours of flight time. Johannes Mackie Steinhach, commander of JG-77, chronicled the severity of the situation.
Replacements were often barely adults, many only 19 years old, with rudimentary training. They had rarely flown above 5,000 meters, had never engaged moving targets in the air, and had no experience with evasive maneuvers. These young pilots were being thrown into battles against seasoned American aviators who often had 400 hours of flight experience, frequently bolstered by previous combat tours. This disparity in skill acted as a force multiplier for U.S. air operations, magnifying the effectiveness of even small numbers of Allied fighters. Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group, who ultimately achieved 21 aerial kills, recalled the growing contrast in pilot proficiency. By spring 1944, a significant portion of German pilots encountered in combat were relatively easy targets. They tended to follow predictable flight patterns, ignored opportunities to use cloud cover for concealment, and often panicked when ambushed. The veteran Luftwaffe pilots remained dangerous adversaries, but they were increasingly scarce. This crisis was compounded by the intensification of the Allied strategic bombing campaign targeting Germany's oil production facilities beginning in May 1944. The attacks caused aviation fuel output to collapse from 180,000 tons in April to just 20,000 tons by September. Fuel shortages forced the Luftwaffe to drastically cut back and eventually cancel routine training flights, limiting combat sorties to only decisive engagements. In contrast, American pilots operated over Germany with relative freedom. P-51 Mustang groups conducted aggressive fighter sweeps, offensive patrols explicitly designed to locate and destroy enemy aircraft. With virtually unlimited fuel reserves, U.S. pilots could patrol over German airfields for extended periods, striking the Luftwaffe when their planes were most vulnerable during takeoff or landing.
The arrival of the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter in the summer of 1944 briefly raised German hopes. With a maximum speed of 540 miles per hour, roughly 100 miles per hour faster than the P-51D, the Me-262 represented a technological leap. Adolf Hitler hailed it as a potential game-changer, capable of reversing Germany's deteriorating position in the air war. Yet, in practice, the jet's advantages were quickly mitigated. American pilots adapted by waiting near Me-262 airbases to engage the jets during takeoff and landing phases when they were slow and exposed. The Mustang's long operational range allowed U.S. forces to patiently exploit these opportunities. Operational challenges further undermined the Me-262's impact. The jet demanded high-grade fuel, which was increasingly scarce. Its engines were delicate and required replacement after only 10 to 25 hours of use, a logistical impossibility given the disrupted German supply networks. Most importantly, the aircraft's effectiveness depended on highly experienced pilots who were in critically short supply. Without veteran aviators to fly them, the Me-262s could not alter the balance of air power. Several individual German Me-262 pilots, such as Franz Schall, who reportedly downed 10 P-51 Mustangs, and Georg Peter Otte, credited with 9 Mustang kills within a total of 12 jet victories, demonstrated remarkable personal skill. However, these achievements, impressive as they were, failed to produce any meaningful strategic effect. Each Mustang shot down was quickly replaced by dozens more, illustrating the overwhelming numerical advantage of the Allied air forces. By the fall of 1944, the P-51 Mustang units had largely shifted their mission from direct air combat to crippling Germany's logistical infrastructure. Operating in coordinated squadron formations, they focused on the destruction of critical components of the transport network: trains, rail depots, bridges, and canal locks. Germany's economy, heavily reliant on rail transport for coal, industrial parts, and food supplies, began to unravel under sustained pressure. On September 11, 1944, a single mission by 36 P-51s of the 357th Fighter Group resulted in the annihilation of 81 locomotives, demonstrating the destructive efficiency of concentrated air attacks.
Over time, this same group accumulated a staggering total of 595.5 confirmed air victories, the highest for any P-51 unit within the 8th Air Force. The severity of the P-51's impact extended beyond material destruction. Albert Speer, Germany's Minister of Armaments and War Production, recorded in his diary that American fighter attacks accomplished what the strategic bombing campaign had failed to achieve: the near-total paralysis of transportation. Coal shipments to power stations halted, factories were starved of essential components, and urban centers faced critical shortages of food. Psychologically, the Mustangs instilled profound demoralization among German aviators. Pilots who had entered the Luftwaffe as confident, highly trained warriors found their sense of mastery shattered. P-51 pilots exhibited a level of audacity and skill that consistently overmatched German forces. They routinely performed bold aerobatics over German cities, staged visible victory displays above recently attacked airfields, and dominated encounters through superior numbers and training. Within Luftwaffe circles, a fatalistic sense of humor emerged as a coping mechanism for the relentless pressure. A common joke among fighter units asked, "What does a German pilot need to earn the Iron Cross?" The answer, a P-51 to escort him to the cemetery, reflecting both dark humor and deep-seated despair. By April 7, 1945, the Luftwaffe mounted one of its final significant operations, known as the Sonderkommando Elbe mission. Roughly 180 to 200 Bf-109s, many piloted by inadequately trained volunteers, launched near-suicidal attacks against American bomber formations. The outcome was disastrous. U.S. fighters destroyed approximately 130 to 140 German aircraft while sustaining minimal losses. From this point onward, the Luftwaffe effectively ceased to function as a cohesive combat force. Although aircraft and pilots remained on paper, the will to engage had dissipated. Commanders largely abandoned operational orders, and what was once a feared and disciplined air force retreated into a state of inactivity, concealing their remaining assets.
The quantitative record of the P-51 Mustang underscores the scale of its impact. A total of 15,586 Mustangs were manufactured, and these aircraft achieved 4,950 confirmed aerial kills, alongside 4,131 confirmed destruction of enemy aircraft on the ground. Losses of P-51s from all causes totaled 2,520, giving a kill-to-loss ratio of roughly 3.6 to 1 in air-to-air combat. German pilot casualties on the Western Front were severe, over 8,000 killed or missing in 1944, and an additional 3,000 from January to May 1945. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe's fighter pilot corps had been decimated, and the force's operational effectiveness had been permanently eroded. Ultimately, the P-51 Mustang was not just a technical marvel, it served as a decisive instrument of strategic attrition. Through relentless attacks on both aircraft and infrastructure, it contributed significantly to the collapse of Germany's air defenses, economy, and morale, marking a turning point in the Allied air campaign over Europe. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe's operational fighter strength had begun a steep decline. Records indicate approximately 1,600 aircraft were mission-ready in June 1944, dropping to 1,480 by January 1945. By April of that year, this number had fallen dramatically to around 1,000, and in the final months of the war, only 325 operational fighters remained. Alongside dwindling numbers, pilot experience eroded sharply. Early in 1944, German fighter pilots typically accumulated between 160 and 220 flight hours before being assigned to frontline units. By late 1944, many pilots had merely 110 to 160 hours, and in 1945, some combat aviators possessed as little as 80 hours of flight training.
In stark contrast, American pilots benefited from a highly structured and rigorous training program. By the same period, U.S. Army Air Forces trainees had logged more than 400 hours of flight time before entering combat, including advanced gunnery exercises, formation maneuvers, and tactical drills. Historians widely recognize the P-51 Mustang as a decisive factor in securing Allied air dominance. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey explicitly credited the P-51 with enabling the Allies to achieve superiority in the skies over Europe more than any other aircraft deployed during the conflict. The Mustang's capabilities allowed the Allies to maintain continuous daylight bombing raids against German targets, ensure control of the air prior to D-Day, and systematically dismantle critical enemy infrastructure, particularly transportation networks and oil production facilities. This operational edge was reinforced by the remarkable industrial output of North American aviation. At peak performance, the company was completing roughly one P-51 every hour and a half. Its Inglewood and Dallas factories employed tens of thousands of workers, nearly 40% of whom were women, highlighting the broad social mobilization behind aircraft production. In comparison, German fighter manufacturing lagged significantly. Though precise German production numbers remain debated due to fragmented records, it is clear that American output of P-51s alone surpassed Germany's combined production of all single-engine fighters between 1944 and 1945. Equally important to air superiority was the U.S. training pipeline. Pilots progressed systematically through multiple phases: 65 hours of primary flight, 75 hours of basic training, 100 hours of advanced instruction, and over 160 hours of operational preparation. This methodical progression ensured that combat-ready aviators arrived at their units with substantial experience, both in flying and in coordinated combat operations. By contrast, German pilots increasingly joined frontline squadrons lacking sufficient training to exploit their aircraft effectively, let alone challenge seasoned opponents. The legacy of the P-51 extends well beyond its wartime record. Its success demonstrated that air dominance arises not solely from superior individual aircraft or pilot skill, but from the integration of advanced technology, systematic training, robust production, and logistical efficiency. In essence, the Mustang exemplified how a coordinated combination of strategy, industry, and human resources can decisively shape the outcome of aerial warfare. The legacy of the P-51 extends well beyond its wartime record. Its success demonstrated that air dominance arises not solely from superior individual aircraft or pilot skill, but from the integration of advanced technology, systematic training, robust production, and logistical efficiency. In essence, the Mustang exemplified how a coordinated combination of strategy, industry, and human resources can decisively shape the outcome of aerial warfare. Former Luftwaffe ace Adolf Galland later acknowledged that the P-51 Mustang was not necessarily superior to German aircraft in every technical or tactical parameter. However, it excelled sufficiently across all critical areas, was produced in vast quantities, operated by highly trained pilots, and supported by virtually unlimited logistical and industrial resources. This combination, he admitted, was insurmountable. At a NATO symposium in 1975, General Gunther Rahl, a Luftwaffe veteran credited with 275 aerial victories, reflected on the transformative effect of the Mustang. The P-51 did more than simply challenge German fighters. It fundamentally altered the concept of air dominance as it had been understood. While German strategy emphasized the skill of individual pilots, tactical engagements, and isolated victories, the Americans approached the air war from a systemic perspective, focusing on industrial output, strategic coordination, and sustained operational capacity. They fought on a different plane of war, and they succeeded. The Luftwaffe, which had swept through Europe between 1939 and 1941, nearly achieving victory over Britain and maintaining overwhelming influence on the Eastern Front, was methodically dismantled by the sheer scale and efficiency of American production. The Mustang itself was the tool of this dismantling, but the true force behind it was the society capable of sustaining such effort. A nation able to design a cutting-edge fighter in just over 3 months, build over 15,000 units, train thousands of pilots to professional standards, and deploy this capability across the Atlantic to secure absolute air supremacy. German aviators who underestimated American fighters in 1943 could not foresee the devastating impact of the P-51 because they failed to grasp the industrial and organizational machinery behind it. They assessed the problem in terms of aircraft models rather than production lines, counted pilots rather than evaluating training programs, and measured operational range rather than considering the full capacity of industrial output. By the time the Luftwaffe comprehended the scope of American power, it was already too late. The hunters became the hunted, and the skies over Europe were dominated by Mustangs. The collapse of the Luftwaffe was more than a military reversal. It was evidence that free societies, when fully mobilized, could leverage capabilities far beyond the reach of even the most centralized authoritarian regimes. Ultimately, the P-51 Mustang demonstrated that success in modern aerial warfare depended not on individual valor or perceived racial superiority, but on the meticulous realities of mass production, structured training, and logistical efficiency. German pilots had never anticipated being overwhelmed by an aircraft. What truly defeated them was the seemingly limitless industrial and societal capacity that underpinned it. When the Luftwaffe finally recognized the nature of the threat, their realization arrived too late, often from the cockpit of a Mustang, under the fire of 50-caliber machine guns while witnessing the destruction of the Reich from above. The P-51 had not only defeated enemy aircraft, it had revealed the unmatched power of a society mobilized for total war.